Hello everyone, Nathan here. Welcome to Nate's Favorite Deck Building Games. This is our fourth episode focusing on the Marvel Legendary deck building game, though this time we continue with 2014 and take sort of a different path than we did before. In our last episode, we looked at the two small expansions for 2014, but 2014 also saw the launch of basically a second core set, a new base game for Legendary. You can play Legendary with either the heroic set that we looked back in episode 1 of looking at Legendary, or you can play with Legendary villains. This is a lot like Forever Evil for the DC deck building game in that it turns things on its head, and you're basically playing as the bad guys against the heroes rather than the other way around. The mechanics are very similar. There are some instances in which certain names are changed in order to reflect the fact that you're playing as a villain instead of a hero, but otherwise, it's very easy to learn once you've already learned how to play the original game. So we're not going to go all into how you play the game. You can go back to episode 1 for that. We are going to take a look at the changes and tweaks between this and the core set. Now, also, just like Forever Evil, there's not a lot of expansions that are specifically for the villains version of Legendary. Right now, there's really only one. From 2015, we have the Fear Itself small expansion. We're actually going to take a look at that in our next episode. So, if you are looking to play Legendary, you'll probably want to pick up that Heroic base set, and then whatever expansions you want to go with it. But if you want a different experience, there is out there Legendary Villains and Fear Itself. Can they be integrated with the others? Absolutely, just like Forever Evil with the DC deck building game. But you're going to have to be dealing with terminology that is different depending on whether the cards are from this or Fear Itself versus everything else. This was actually the first one I learned how to play for Legendary, though, so I had kind of a backward experience. So let's take a look at what exactly there is in Legendary Villains. You'll, of course, have a rulebook, and this is a full rulebook. It's not like the ones that come with the expansions that are just about the changes. This is a full-sized rulebook. It's actually laid out very much like the original rulebook for the heroic version, and you have a playmat. Now, we've been looking at the original sets on that big cardboard playmat. There is a little roll-out rubber playmat you can use for that one as well that's a little bit more condensed and lets us zoom in a bit more. We will probably use that one going forward when looking at other heroic sets. When it comes to these villain sets, we're going to use this one that comes with the Villains core set. It's rolled up and runs down the center of that box we just saw. Very similar, but we have some terminology changes and such that we'll see. We used to have that little table up in the corner that told us how many of different types of cards go into the different decks depending on the number of players. That is over here off to the side, along with other setup instructions. We have our bystander stack. We have a thing called adversaries taking the place of our villain deck. We have allies taking the place of our hero deck. We then have bindings replacing wounds. We have the lair replacing the headquarters. We have the city up here, but notice the city segments are in the opposite order that they were before. Instead of having a villain enter the sewers, work their way to the bridge, and then escape, now we have heroes, or adversaries, who are in the city, who start on the bridge, work their way to the sewers by pushing you essentially back to the sewers, and then if they go beyond that, they overrun you, or overrun the city. We have plots here in place of schemes. We have a place for twists, plot twists in this case, as opposed to scheme twists, but very similar. We have a commander rather than a mastermind, but very similar. We have a place to put our strikes, and for our always available cards, we now have 2 instead of 1. Rather than having Maria Hill over here, we now have a Hydra always available card and a new recruits stack for a new recruit always available card. Again, it's going to play very similarly. You'll notice also there is no KO space. There's not a KO space on the playmat for the heroic version either, just on that large game board. KO usually just means put it somewhere outside of the game, so we don't really need a space for it. But this is where it would have been on that previous set that we've been looking at. So the game itself, again, plays very much like the original game. It's mainly just a matter of some terminology changing and a very small number of different mechanics here. Some new mechanics being introduced that are kind of cool, but some that are different interpretations of some of the stuff we've seen before. So we start out with everybody having their starting decks, but instead of having shield agents and shield troopers in it, we now have Hydra Operative. Hydra Operative, just like our shield agent, is going to give us 1 recruit point and has a cost of 0. We have this new Hydra team icon or affiliation icon up there. We also then, instead of the troopers, are going to have the Hydra soldier for a 1 attack value. Again, 0 cost, Hydra affiliation there. These are allies as opposed to heroes. Ally is going to be a word that is essentially synonymous with heroes in the other set. So we have these. We're going to have our regular size starting decks. Nothing changes there. We are going to have some type of scheme that's going on, but because we're talking about heroes doing something we're trying to stop, it's not good to necessarily call a scheme. Instead, we call them plots. And we have a set here of plots for the game. We have 8 of these. This core set includes Infiltrate the Lair with Spies, Mass-Produce War Machine Armor, Resurrect Heroes with the Norn Stones, Build an Underground Megavault Prison, Cage Villains in Power-Suppressing Cells, Crown Thor King of Asgard, Crush Hydra, Graduation at Xavier's X Academy. So, as always, we're going to have one of those over in the plot area face up. I'm just going to stack them there to give us a place to put them out of the way here. We are going to have scheme twists that will happen as part of our deck here that goes into the city row, called the adversary deck rather than the villain deck this time. But we are going to have those twists that can happen, but since that is a plot, not a scheme, we call them plot twists instead. And we have ourselves quite a few of those to be able to pull into the game as well. For the record, it's 12 of these, and oftentimes we will have reasons to set the twists beside the plot itself. So rather than just having it sit there, like is the case a lot of times in the regular game with the scheme twists, instead for villains, they've given us a place to put those twists. In place of wounds, we have bindings. We have 30 of those bindings cards. These do work differently than wounds. We'll talk about that momentarily. So we'll stick our bindings up there as well. We're also going to have a bystander stack over here with some of those bystanders getting shuffled into adversaries. Just like what we saw with Dark City, the bystander stack is going to be face down, because just like where Dark City introduced some unique bystanders or special bystanders into the mix that just weren't there in the core hero set, this villain's core set, having learned from that development, actually has 30 regular bystanders in it that just have our victory point of 1 and just say bystander, but then also has 3 each of a special bystander called Rockstar, 3 each of a special bystander called Public Speaker, 3 each of one called Engineer, and 3 each of one called Computer Hacker. So these wind up all getting shuffled together into our bystander stack, and then the stack itself is going to go over here face down. We're going to draw from that when we're supposed to rescue a bystander, or kidnap a bystander in this case, and we're going to draw from that when the time comes to actually build our adversary deck. Among our always available cards, in place of the Shield Officer, which was Maria Hill, we now have Madame Hydra, right? To recruit, got our 3 cost here. Does have some new information here, the dodge ability, but we will talk about that here momentarily. We also have, to play this card, you must discard a card from your hand. So she does have a little bit more of a cost when playing her than otherwise would be the case, but she is a Hydra team card. She's going to be there in our always available area. For the record, there are 15 of her, and then we have the new recruits, another type of ally. No team here. And the new recruits are going to be able to be acquired for 2 recruit points, have 1 attack value. There are 15 of them as well. They'll sit over here, but when you play them, it says, return this card to the new recruit stack. Draw a card. You still get this new recruit's attack. So basically, if this is something that you wind up recruiting, you pay your 2, you recruit it, goes into your discard pile. Eventually, it winds up getting shuffled into your deck, it comes into your hand. As soon as you play it, you get the 1 attack, you get to draw a card, but you immediately put it back in the new recruit stack rather than it going into your discard pile. So there's a constant stream and cycle of new recruits entering and leaving that stack, allowing you to get a little bit of attack and to draw a card out of it. So it's useful, but it's not something that you keep throughout the entire game. Rather than masterminds, we're going to have what are called commanders. Commanders basically work like masterminds. There are 5 different commander cards. One is the actual commander themselves, telling us what they always lead and what to do in the case of a strike, in this case called a command strike instead of a master strike. And then there are 4 tactics underneath it, this time called commander tactics, that have to be defeated as you defeat them over and over again. Just like with that core set, we've got ourselves a handful of commanders in this case as opposed to masterminds to fight. We have Professor X. Notice there always leads X-Men first class. Tells you what a command strike does, gives you a value there, gives you victory points. Then he does have his tactics, each with a fight activity that happens. So, Professor X. We have Odin. Notice they all say commander under the name. We have Nick Fury. And then we have Doctor Strange. Again, one of these, with their tactics face down underneath them, will wind up over there in our commander spot here. I'll just put them all together there just to have a place to put them for the moment. And again, there will be strikes involved, in this case called command strikes, which are going to be worked into that adversary's deck, kind of like the villain deck, so that when they come out, something happens based on the strike command on our commander card. And we have ourselves 8 of those available as well. As I just say command strike, just like the other one said master strike. And as they get used, as we have a place we need to put them, they actually give us a spot to stick them as necessary rather than us just sitting them off to the side somewhere. Now, just like with our old villain deck, the adversary's deck is going to be built from multiple sources. We're going to include 5 of our command strikes, and then the number of adversary groups, which is like villain groups, backup adversaries, which is like henchmen, and bystanders, which are still just called bystanders, that we add depends on the number of players playing. And you can look at that information there on the playmat, or it does give you that information there in the instruction booklet. So it could be anything from 1 player going up against 1 adversary group with 3 cards from 1 backup adversary group instead of 10, and 1 bystander in it, or it could be 5 players playing against 4 adversary groups with 2 backup adversary groups and 12 bystanders all shuffled in. We looked at how that type of thing got built last time. We're not going to go through the building process, but let's take a look at what cards are included in this set. When we're talking about henchmen, in the original set, we talked about basically enemies that weren't quite as powerful as the main enemies that you were going up against, and nowhere near as powerful as our mastermind that was in charge of the whole scheme. In this case, the commander in charge of the whole plot. So these are basically cards that are sets of 10, all identical, that are sort of lower level enemies to fight. Rather than calling them henchmen, they call them backup, or backup adversaries. We have Asgardian Warrior, Multiple Man, which I think is kind of cool, the idea that you'd have a group of multiple men, because multiple men can make copies of himself. We then have a Shield Assault Squad. And then lastly, we got the Cops. Okay. So 4 different options as far as different backup adversary groups to grab and shuffle into your adversary's deck, depending on how many the game says you need. Then just like with building our villain deck for the original game, we would have groups of 8 that represent individual villains, or groups of villains as the case may be. They get shuffled in there, the number of them, of course, depending on how many players are playing. In this case, rather than calling them villains, they are called adversaries. Those groups of 8 cards include the Avengers, the Spider Friends, so a nice parallel to groups we've seen before, the Uncanny Avengers, which we have not seen yet from the core game, the Defenders, a group called X-Men First Class, so the original X-Men, the Uncanny X-Men, and then finally our 7th, Marvel Knights. Again, you're the villains, these are the people you're going up against who are all working theoretically for that commander. Then, of course, we're going to have groups of 14 cards each that represent individuals who you can recruit to help you in your struggle. Back in the original game, they were called heroes. Here they are called allies. Again, the number of groups, the number of ally card sets completely depends on the number of players, but they all get shuffled together and put into your ally deck here, and they'll be the ones that fill the lair just like they fill the headquarters in the original game. We do have some new teams involved because we are talking about very different groups than we've seen before. So among our allies, we have Mysterio. Notice here the 6. This is from the Sinister Six team. We have Electro, also from the Sinister Six. Dr. Octopus from the Sinister Six. Kraven from the Sinister Six. Venom from the Sinister Six. And the 6th from the Sinister Six, we have Green Goblin. We then have characters from the Brotherhood, starting with Sabretooth, Magneto, Mystique, and Juggernaut. From the Foes of Asgard team, we then have Loki, and we have Enchantress. Then we have 2 from the Crime Syndicate team. We have Kingpin, and we have Bullseye. And then with no team affiliation at all, we have Ultron. Now, as far as other gameplay mechanics, Overrun works the same way as Escape. Basically, there'll just be a keyword Overrun on the card, and if they reach the sewers and then get pushed one more, they Overrun as opposed to Escape, and whatever Overrun ability gets triggered right then. Not a shock there. Bindings do work a little bit differently than wounds. Wounds were all about this idea of being able to basically heal your wounds if you didn't acquire anything from the lair or defeat, or the headquarters in that case, or defeat anyone up in the city, but it was all about just taking them and getting rid of them. Whereas with Bindings, Bindings has a new keyword, which is Betrayal. If you don't recruit any allies or defeat any adversaries or commanders on your turn, so the same conditions as for a wound, you may KO a Bindings from your hand. If you do, the player to your right gains all the other Bindings from your hand. So instead of basically being able to use a turn where you're not acquiring or defeating anything to just heal yourself, you're breaking your bonds, but while some of those chains are just gone, the rest of those wind up on one of the other players. You're betraying one of your fellows, very much like you would expect from a villain. So bindings are similar to wounds. When you're playing them from your hand, if you're not going to use them to get rid of them with that betrayal keyword, they are just useless cards sitting there taking up space, the same as the point of the wounds, but they do get dealt with to get rid of them in a somewhat different way. There's also a new keyword, which we see there on Madam Hydra and other cards, which is Dodge. Dodge just means that you can take that card while it's in your hand and just discard it in order to draw a new card. So you can just sort of cycle it out of the way if you don't think it's going to be useful to you that turn. Only bearing in mind any other text that's on there doesn't kick in. If you do the dodge, you're not playing it from your hand, you're just using the ability to take it from your hand to your discard pile and replace it. So in this case, you could dodge it without having to worry about to play this card, you must discard a card from your hand. But then if you do play it, that happens, and you've given up your chance to dodge because you've already played it rather than it being sitting in your hand to be returned to discard to draw a new card. So kind of a cool way to manage your hand there with dodge. You then have, typically on X-Men based cards, the extreme attack keyword. Basically, if you have a character sitting there with extreme attack, they wind up getting +1 to their attack rating for every other individual in the city that has the extreme attack keyword. So if we have 3 different X-Men on here, we have Colossus and 2 more that both have extreme attack, then the fact that that one's there gives him +1, that one's there gives him +1, so he goes from 5 to 7. He doesn't count himself, but his keyword allows him to draw upon the resources of his fellows to kick some butt. We then have a new keyword, which is elusive. Okay? To fight one of these adversaries, you just use their attack rating, right? You just knock them out that way. But elusive gives you a number, kind of like Versatile gave us a number, and that number tells you how much recruit you have to have developed that turn before you could do the attack. So this Wasp card here says elusive 7. So even though she only costs 1 attack to knock her out, you have to have played enough cards to have earned at least 7 recruit points this turn before you can even attempt to attack her. You don't spend the recruit points to do the attack, but you have to have met that threshold before you can go after her at all. We then also have a new term that's easy to miss because it's not generally going to be in bold. The term is demolish. like in this case, demolish each player. So what does that mean? In this case, it's his overrun ability. So there's that overrun keyword. So if he was in the sewers and moves out of the sewers by being pushed, his overrun ability kicks in. He goes there just like escaping. So demolish means pull the top card off the ally deck, look at its cost, then just stick it on the bottom of the ally deck so you don't know what's coming. Whatever that cost was, every player then has to reveal their hand and take some card in their hand with that same cost and discard it. Not KO it, just discard it. But it means that everybody's going to be coming into their next turn one card short of whatever that cost was. Now, for future reference, in case you want to use this villainous set with one of the heroic sets, or if you're just curious about what terms are considered synonymous as opposed to being slightly different, like, say, bindings and wounds, between the different sets, the different villainous and heroic sets, the terms that mean essentially the same thing are hero and ally, because that's those groups of 14 cards in this deck over here, villain and adversary, those sets of 8 cards each that wind up in the deck over here, henchman villain and backup adversary, right, those groups of 10 cards that are identical that wind up in the deck over here, mastermind and commander, the one you're going up against with the different mastermind or commander tactics, which is the next equivalent term, mastermind tactic and commander tactic, command strike and master strike, same thing, scheme and plot, same thing, escape and overrun, same thing. Yes, that does mean that if I was going to be playing, say, with that Captain America card, and for some reason he escapes when I'm playing on the regular hero board, where they escape from the bridge and it goes into an escape pile, the overrun action does still happen. Overrun and escape are considered equivalent terms. A villain capturing a bystander in the original game is, in this case, an adversary guarding a bystander when there's a bystander sat underneath them. If a player rescues a bystander in the original game, here it is a player kidnapping a bystander, but they mean the same thing. And when it comes to win conditions, if you're playing with the original set, sometimes you'll hit a point where something happens that loses the game for everyone, and it'll be termed as evil wins. Obviously, if you're playing the villain set, the equivalent term for that is good wins. But if you are mixing them together, it just depends on the terminology on your card. But either way, if it says good wins or evil wins, it means essentially the game has beaten the players. Just remember that bindings and wounds are not the same thing. Our always available cards are not the same thing. And no, the teams are not considered the same thing. So these starting cards and always available cards that are Hydra for villains don't just automatically count as Shield when you're playing the regular game. Shield and Hydra are still considered separate teams, even if you're dealing with always available cards that may come from either. They're not necessarily meant to coordinate between the heroes and villains sets. So kind of a fun, cool way to change up the way that you play. It's just a matter really of getting a handle on the terminology. Otherwise, the vast majority of this game plays the same way as the original game does. For me, it was actually a little tricky because, like I said, this is the first game of Legendary I learned how to play. Then I had to go back and learn how to play the rest of the games using different terminology than I was already used to from this one. It takes a little bit of time, but you'll be in good shape fairly quickly. And again, if you want to play the villains version of the game, there's really only this big set and the Fear Itself small expansion that specifically focus on playing as the villains. So it's easy to get your hands on all those materials rather than trying to get the tons and tons of expansions for the heroic version of the game. They can be played together though, if you like. Just be careful of those equivalent terms. Next time, we'll take a quick look at the only expansion thus far geared specifically toward this, the aforementioned Fear Itself from 2015.